I'm delighted to be part of this project to bring Rebecca Abbott's fantastic documentary on the Irish famine diaspora to a wider audience. I was very honoured to be part of it with a number of my historian colleagues and to actually hear the stories of people descended from survivors of the famine. This is an important documentary and it has clear lessons for today as we cope with the refugee crisis and more recently a coronavirus epidemic or pandemic. So please take a moment to watch this documentary and to reflect on the important messages it is sharing with us.
Hello, my name is Gabriel Byrne. Please listen with me as we learn the story of the Great Famine, or the Great Hunger as it's sometimes known, or to those who survived those especially dark days of our history on Drochail, the bad times.
Loch Curragh, Kinvara, June 5th, 1863. My dear son, I was happy to hear by your letter of your family being well, but sorry to hear of your own delicate state. But I trust in the Lord it will not be so bad as you apprehend. Now, my dear son, the present state of this country is most alarming. The most dire distress prevails through the country, hundreds emigrating. In fact, anyone who can amass what will take him away is leaving. Such is the miserable state of Ireland. My dear son, it grieves me so much to be so frequently troubling you.
You read these accounts of the actual famine years being filled with silence. Malachy Horan wrote about it afterwards and said it wasn't even so much the hunger, it was the sheer openness. I mean, all those missing people, those lives either suddenly interrupted and lost or else abandoned by people who went somewhere else. And you have this sense of what one poet called the awful absence moping through the land.
My grandmothers would say, you know, Mary, there's no ways that you could manage how bad it was, he said, because tomorrow you didn't know whether you were going to eat or not.
To the dispensary and the grave over there. Yeah. This is the one who stayed.
What you know, Juan?
I'm with my third cousin, Mary Morris, from San Leandro, California, who was born here in Kinvara on Loch Curragh, and my great-grandfather, Michael W. Morris, and her great-grandfather, help me, Mary.
Yeah, it's great, but that's
great.
okay.
What was his name, James?
James, yes.
James were born in the same little house. Michael W. Morris left here in 1847 during the height of the famine, kissed his mother goodbye at that cottage. The likelihood is that he came to Philadelphia. He wasn't the only one to flee.
No, not at all.
There were many
There
Irish
was
from this.
from the village. What they would do is they would all get together and they would send one person at a time. You know what I mean? And then when that person went, they would ask them as soon as they could, they would send money to get another person. They left because there was basically starving.
I remain, my dear son, your affectionate father, James Morris. P.S. I hope you will write soon, leaving all to yourself, as this is a bad summer. I hope that you will send me what you think fit yourself. The village you were reared in is now reduced to 7 houses. Francis Gallagher left Kinvara 15th of May.
When Great Britain brought Ireland under its rule in 1801, it was a small addition to Britain's extensive network of colonies, all linked by lucrative trade routes and defended by the powerful British Army. For most of the 19th century, in fact, Great Britain was the largest and richest empire in history. Ireland, with its farmland and labourers, was expected to provide grains, butter, livestock and other commodities to its British rulers. Yet, at the same time, about half the population of Ireland was so poor that they survived entirely on the potato. It was a dangerous dependence on only one crop, but they had little choice. By 1800, very few Irish people owned land. Most were tenants of Anglo-Irish landowners. But they survived because the potato is so nourishing that a small plot of land could provide almost a year's worth of food for a family, while they laboured for the landlord to pay the rent. On Gorta Moor, the Great Hunger began in Ireland in 1845 and continued more than 7 years. But it wasn't just a period of tragic starvation brought about when a new and virulent fungus struck the potato plant. The stage for this intense crisis had been set over several hundred years. At the core was the land in Ireland and the changing laws that governed it.
Why did so many people come to depend on the potato by the 1840s? And the answer really is in centuries of colonisation and dispossession of land of the native Irish, particularly the Catholics.
Now the English had come, or the Normans had come in the 12th century, but in fact Norman/English society from the 12th to the 16th century and Irish Gaelic society coexisted, mostly, if not peacefully, at least no more aggressively against one another than internally among themselves, until the 16th century and the Reformation.
In the 1500s, Tudor monarchs created large plantation areas in Ireland, replacing native Catholic Irish with English and Scottish Protestant settlers.
Then in the 17th century, Ireland becomes sucked into the Civil War in England. There's war, there's famine, there's ravaging. It's a terrible century in Irish history.
Later in the century, in the wake of the Battle of the Boyne, 1690, a body of legislation was introduced, the penal laws, and that made it impossible for Catholics to purchase land, to inherit land, or in fact to advance themselves in any other way, because they couldn't build schools, join the professions, own horses, they couldn't vote. So it really undermined them both politically, socially and economically.
From 1700 on, you get control of the land by basically Protestant and ultimately English-oriented landlords. That leads, in the course of the 18th century, to the creation of a landlord class which looks on tenants as them.
The old colonialists who came over with Queen Elizabeth I's armies argued, a bit like people said about Native Americans, that the natives are just nomads. They have no title to the land. It needs sober Protestant settlers to understand how to maximize the creativity and productivity of land.
Do you know when they refurbished this? They had torn back the plaster and there was graffiti, Morrises from around the 11th century. Now, Morris is an old, one of the 13 tribes of Galway, so it's probably one of our relatives. But here we are at this church that you used to go to as a girl, right?
Oh, absolutely, all the
Yeah.
time.
Anyhow, my family were the Morrises, and they were one of the 12 tribes that came to Galway. They came in the 12th century. My ancestry have lived here for hundreds and hundreds of years, and the English landlords took over whatever piece of land they had and they made them tenants. At one time there was 14 houses in the village, 14 tenants. They were working for themselves but giving all the money they made to the landlords.
The labourer grows his potatoes, works for the landlord or for a stronger farmer, renting the small holding, and his labour pays off the rent. Very little money is exchanged. And one of the huge problems of the Great Famine was that even though food was exported, it was exported because the domestic market wasn't big enough to pay for food. The poor at the bottom of the heap are dying for want of food because they have no money to buy the food that is being exported.
We're in what the main bedroom of the house, and several people would sleep in here. Husband and wife, and they might be over in this corner. There might be a brother of or sister, or as many people as they could get in would stay. Where they mainly, this was the center of the family was here. And they had two hobs, which we would call, one each side there, and this was the main fireplace with a chimney going up. You'd have about 10 people here, living here at the time, at the same time.
Did you ever have running water in here?
Never had running water.
So you draw it from the...
You'd go down to you'd carry the water in buckets up from the lake.
So I assume my great-grandfather had 17-year-old kissed, had his final meal here in September of 1847, the height of the famine.
Yeah.
Goodbye, Mother. Went right through this door to America.
There had been potato failures before 1845 crop failures, but mostly they were for 1 year. What made the famine unique really was the fact that the potato failed again and again and again. So it was the longevity of the failure.
One shouldn't forget that while people are dying in the ditches in the 1840s in Ireland, they're putting up the Crystal Palace in London, not that far away. That Ireland is part of what is in fact the most successful political and social entity, for all its flaws, Britain and the British Empire at the time.
But in 1846, the new government, led by Lord John Russell, responded by introducing public works into the country and making that the main form of relief. And it was a very harsh system of relief.
We're here in a townland of Greg in North Cork. The landlord was an absentee landlord. What we're walking on the moment is the actual famine relief road. It's one of thousands across the country. So the idea was that you had engineers coming along. They would more or less draw a line on a map from point A to point B. There was very little surveying done. Basically, there were oftentimes roads starting nowhere and going nowhere. The foundation of the road was to be about 6 inches of crushed stone. Now, of course, the stone was crushed by the actual labourers themselves. And what you would have is that you would have whole families coming to work on the relief. These would be destitute, starving people now. They were paid for an adult between 8 and about 10 pence for their day's work. However, you would have to start at 6 o'clock in the morning and finish at 6 o'clock in the evening. So it was a 12-hour day. If you started after 6 o'clock, between 6 and 9, you only got half a day's pay. And if you arrived at the work after 9 o'clock, you wouldn't get paid at all.
And added to that, as we know, many of them didn't have adequate clothing because they pawned it. And the winter of 1846, 1847 was in fact the coldest winter on record for over 100 years. So people were out doing these useless bits of work in terrible weather conditions, and they were hungry.
Here we are on another relief road in the townland of Inchinnock. This is the second relief road in the small area, only about 2 miles from the last one. And this road, again, the idea was that it would follow the river line and create a more direct route from East Cork to West Cork. The rock here was actually cut by hand by the labourers as part of the works. If I stand alongside it, it must be over 20 foot high of solid rock that they had to cut out. All the ways down, down along, down probably in this section, probably a quarter of a mile of solid rock that had to be cut by hand. And then of course they were able to use the rock that they had chiselled here to construct a wall at the riverside to support the actual road from falling into the river. There was many cases where actually entire families were working on the project at one time. And if they died on the works, as many of them did, they wouldn't get paid at all. Countless people actually died on this particular stretch of the relief road, and they are buried above in Duns Peter's well, which is just across the river up about a half a mile from here.
Despite many years of struggle with British rulers for control of the country, Ireland in 1801 was officially brought under the rule of the British Parliament through the Act of Union. But this change did not give the Irish people the same rights as others in the new United Kingdom.
What we've had in Ireland, there's million deaths, million immigrants, and they keep going. You know, these are supposedly a part of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. So the man woman in West Mayo is an equal citizen to the man in Suffolk, or woman in Suffolk. Yet that's not the way Ireland is being run or treated.
This became very clear in the 1838 Poor Law that the British made for Ireland.
The poor law that was introduced to Ireland was much harsher than anything in England, Wales or Scotland. So in Ireland, poor people were not entitled to relief through any legal mechanism. If Irish people wanted relief, they had to become inhabitants, or as the phrase was, inmates of the workhouses. When families went into them, they had to go in as family units. They would be split up. The male adults, the female adults were separated. Children between 2 and 15 were separated, and then children under the age of 2 were again separated into their own area.
From 1847, Irish property was supposed to pay for Irish poverty, which it couldn't do. After 1847, when the public works are gone, the soup kitchens are gone, all poverty, famine, destitution is to be processed in the workhouse. They couldn't remotely deal with it.
Under this system, Ireland was divided into 130 poor law unions, each with its own workhouse and board of guardians. Each union paid for the building and administration of its workhouse with new taxes or rates on the property owners and property occupiers of that union.
The poor law operates on the basis that rates are collected to build a workhouse, and then the rates continue to be collected to support the workhouse.
The man who introduced the workhouses to Ireland, George Nichols, said that because each poor law union was a self-financing unit, that in a time of famine, the system would break down, because the very poorest unions, which needed most relief, had the least resources to pay for that relief. And what happened after 1847 was that some workhouses literally closed the doors because they were bankrupt.
The north of Ireland was not immune to the devastating impact of the famine, the poor law and the workhouse system. At the beginning of 1847, the Lurgan workhouse in County Armagh suffered a death rate that was as bad as the hardest hit areas of the south and west of the country, and included both Catholics and Protestants. Throughout Ireland, 1/3 people died in workhouses during the course of the famine.
People actually went in just to die because they became so overcrowded. People would be sleeping on dirty straw or people who were already sick, and so disease would spread. People were buried en masse within the workhouses. So there was really very little dignity to going in a workhouse, either to try and survive or to just simply be buried.
The famine is kind of the central catalyst, in the middle of the century that hurries along all sorts of things that have been happening before that. I mean, the labouring poor had been hugely hit by, we have to go back to the Napoleonic Wars, the end of the Napoleonic Wars. 1815, the British stopped buying lots of grain. They don't need it to feed their armies. Ireland has benefited from that. Grain production needs a lot of intensive individual labour. As soon as that happened, and you get in after 1815 into the 1820s and 30s, the big farmers are saying it's much more productive for us to grow cattle. And cattle you don't need labourers.
Estate consolidation. You tidy up everything. Typically what a landlord would do is, if there were 20 tenants in a given area, and you felt that it only needed 1/3 that number, you would evict the surplus amount and redistribute the land among the remainder. In a lot of places it was happening before 1845. A lot of it had to do with the new Poor Law Act that was coming in, and would mean that property taxes were rising.
After 1847, landowners became responsible for paying the poor rates to maintain the workhouses. The level of taxation increased massively, and even good landowners, this put a tremendous burden on them.
Some landlords basically sought to evict their tenants without calling it eviction. Because shifting from tillage to livestock means the human element isn't required.
Right, what we have here, as you can see, is a fairly substantial tillage field growing wheat. During the famine times, this was actually a patchwork of fields. There was over 40 fields here making up this whole area, and probably about 8 to 10 farm holdings. And they'd be tenant farmers. The local landlords were Hudsons living beyond the village in the manor house. He bought their tenant agreements off them and paid them between £1 and £5 depending on the sizes of their holdings, and he also paid for their passage to America. So in effect, I suppose you could say that it was a double clearing. First he cleared it of the population, and then he cleared it of the fields and the houses and all the buildings. And the stone from those buildings was used in building the manor walls as you see down the village. But I suppose in a sense it gave the people some chance of a new life in the new world. Whereas, for instance, people over there, where you can see the shed in the distance, that's Greg, and that was an absentee landlord, and they had no chance. When they felt destitute, there was no one to support them, they had no means. You need to have a certain amount of means to be able to immigrate, and they were left to their own devices. In most cases, they starved to death or died of famine-related illnesses.
I don't really believe that there was genocidal intent on the part of the British, but I do believe the rural Irish proverb that says, God sent the potato blight, but the English caused the famine. The idea of just clearing out these, what were seen as uneconomic rural communities, and that maybe even if there was a God, that God had connived in this modernising effect. This is all part of the narrative.
Probably. Yeah. They sure had a nice place here. This is the house where Lady Gregory resided. Well, this is part of what's left of the house where Lady Gregory resided, her and her husband, William Gregory. And as you can see, there's not much left.
One of the changes that was really particularly harsh was what was known as the Gregory Clause, which was part of the 1847 legislation.
If you held more than a quarter of an acre, you and your dependents could not get any relief in the workhouse, which means that you have to surrender anything over a quarter of an acre if you want relief in the workhouse. That Act of 1847 was a major cause of de facto mass eviction in Ireland after the summer of 1847.
One of the first things that was done when a person was evicted was the house was levelled so that they wouldn't come back and reoccupy it, and also to wipe it out as a tax-bearing holding.
After 1847, there was just massive evictions. Homelessness becomes a massive problem and really exacerbates the existing problem of hunger in Ireland.
Colonel Vandeleur owned every square inch of this town, and his ambitions were boundless. He wanted to make this into a port. There's very deep water down there. There's a sheltered harbour, and 3,000 miles away is the United States. This was the big thing in Crofton Moore Vandeleur's life, the development of Kilrush town, and he loved it. The estate that he had, he inherited 19,000 acres or thereabouts, and at the end of the famine we'll see he wound up at 26,000. He did seriously well out of the famine.
There are some landlords who tried to help their tenants. Some landlords genuinely suffered, but there are some landlords who really took advantage of the vulnerability of their tenants, and they used the famine as an excuse to evict their tenants in the cruelest way. And Lord Vandeleur stands out exactly for that reason.
In the course of the famine, he evicted 1,000 of his own tenants, and as far as we know, the vast majority of them died of fever, exposure to the cold, starvation. Relatively few of them ever got near the workhouse. One of the reasons being that Vandeleur, who was the chairman of the Kilrush Board of Guardians, did his level best to restrict the right of admission to the workhouse. His existence was spent in endeavouring to do good amongst all those around him. I don't fully understand the determination to get rid of the poor by any means, or to see the mass death of the poor as an acceptable price to pay for civic development.
People who were evicted but had no homes didn't want to go into the workhouses for all the reasons we've talked about. They would exist in what was called a scalp, and it was just a makeshift shelter.
A mud cabin built of organic material with just a door, no windows, no solid walls, no solid roof. The one thing that a mud hut needs is that it needs to be kept dry and warm, or else it starts collapsing in on itself. If you and your family are beginning to starve, you lose the ability to be able to go out, collect firewood to make a little fire to keep your little cabin warm. You weren't able to keep it warm, it wasn't kept dry, dampness came in, the rain came in through the roof, and the whole thing collapsed in on top of the family that were living inside it.
I think the sense of interruption of people's lives is massive. If you look at the paintings of the Irish in the years before the famine, it's a canvas filled with crowds. And then all of a sudden the country isn't crowded. It's gone from 9 million to 4 or 5 million.
Taxation is raised to cope with the colossal pressure on the poor law. There's gross overcrowding in the workhouses. A massive number of people, somewhere in the region of 700,000, were affected by, in effect, compulsory eviction. And a substantial number of those then made their way across the Atlantic.
Even before the famine, Irish people did emigrate, but it was mostly the better off people and people who went in families, who went in the expectation of doing better, very different from famine emigration, where people fled in desperation.
I've spent quite a bit of time trying to put myself in their minds, try to figure out why they left Ireland when they did. But it's been hard for me to do that because of the difficulties. We can't really imagine the loss of the mother.
In the spring and summer of 1847, 250,000 people, most of them poor Irish, left British and Irish ports heading for the United States and British North America, now Canada.
At the core of it, there was a family that left Ireland in 1847. They came from County Fermanagh, a mother and a father and 4 sons.
My ancestor was Thomas, the 3rd son, and Scott's was Robert.
Yeah.
There was Robert, Edward, Thomas, and James. Emerson.
And the parents' names were John Emerson and Isabella Armstrong. They came over on a ship from Londonderry called the Sesostris. And it took 31 days crossing the ocean, and it came here and was in quarantine for 9 days. And at some point during the journey, the mother, whose name was Isabella, died.
Many immigrants traveled on passenger ships, but the poorest were carried on cargo ships designed to carry timber, not humans, because the fare was half as costly. Some American ports raised fees and tightened restrictions to prevent an influx of the sick and poor. So the destination for many of these immigrants was Grosse Ile, a quarantine station built on a small island in the St. Lawrence River near the city of Quebec, Canada. A portion of these immigrants were sent by landlords looking for a way to lower their tax burden and clear their estates of excess tenants.
Quite a number of landlords do actually pay for tenants to get to America. Others promise to pay and don't. The ships that are hired by many landlords are not very seaworthy. A colossal number of debts on board, more debts while they're in quarantine, more debts still when they're brought ashore.
The interesting thing about the Dunbrody and most of these famine ships in general is that they were actually cargo ships all along, in the sense that they weren't prepared or built or supposed to carry humans at all. They were bound for places like Quebec and North America in general, because that's where cargo would have been. Most passengers would have carried things like cholera, typhus, tuberculosis and dysentery, and that's before the journey even takes off. There's little or no light or air down there, and a lot of rats would have been swarming on board as well. And then things like extreme malnourishment, dehydration and overcrowding. I mean, you've got 200 people living in steerage alone. Then you've got to remember that nearly everybody on a ship like this have had zero experience at sea. Many of them have never even seen the ocean before. It's the fear factor and it's everything else as well. So it affects them just as much mentally as physically too. They think that maybe about a quarter of the people on board ships like this died, sometimes even half.
Relative to other cargo ships, the Dunbrody's passengers were well cared for and had a low mortality rate. Their experience was quite different from others who rode on so-called coffin ships, named for their terrible and deadly conditions on board.
The conditions on the ships are very similar to the descriptions you get of slave ships. And if you die on the passage, you're just flung overboard.
The staff at Grosse Ile was soon completely overwhelmed by the sheer numbers of sick and dying who started arriving daily. The island was designed to handle up to 250 individuals. Winter ice had cleared on the St. Lawrence River by the beginning of May 1847. But by the end of that month, 36 ships, carrying over 12,000 immigrants, stood in line at Grosse Ile, waiting to unload their healthy, their sick, and their many dead passengers.
I can't imagine what it would have been like to have lost their mother, to have seen this place and their mother probably in, well...
When they left here without their mother, we believed that the next place they wanted to go was Moores, New York, south of Montreal, just inside the United States. Then in the 1850s, our family moved to Wisconsin at almost the same time as a part of the New York State family.
My great-grandmother, Rebecca Emerson, was born in Wisconsin and moved to Little Falls, met a Singer sewing machine salesman, and moved to Manitoba in 1899. The two sons eventually left Wisconsin and went to Little Falls, Minnesota, and our great-great-great-grandfather, John Emmett Emerson, is buried there.
A newspaper article in Wapaka said Robert Emerson of this city has recently heard from his father, who moved a few years ago to Little Falls, Minnesota. Right. They seem to want everybody to know that John Emerson was still in good health.
Wrote in a plain, steady hand, we commented.
That's right. Like it here, and then we can see the graves from here too. This is really the most important thing I wanted to come and see, because if she lies anywhere on dry land, Isabella has to be here. And I was taken by how small of a space that this looks to be to hold 5,400 people in it.
The example of the reception of the Irish in Canada is one of the great, what I would call humanitarian achievements of the 19th century.
She's my grandmother's grandmother's grandmother. I've gotten to know her family through the research I've done over the last 30 years, but she's still a very mysterious figure to me. This is right now maybe the most I can ever know about her, that everything has led up to just being able to visit this field. I hope she's here. I like to think that she's here rather than at the bottom of the sea. Isabella, we'll never know.
This is Hyde Park Barracks, which is one of the original convict-built buildings in Sydney. It's been used for military barracks and housing the Earl Grey girls. and also an institute for housing the destitute and sick women. So it's almost become like a workhouse again.
The monument is here to memorialise the 4,114 orphans that came out from Ireland during the famine 160 years ago.
In 1788, Australia was established as a penal colony for convicts transported from Great Britain and Ireland. Most convicts were men, as were other immigrants who came for business opportunities, and by 1830 the population of Australia was overwhelmingly male. So in 1831, the British and Australian governments began a program that subsidised the cost of immigration for women to help the colony normalise and grow. But that program ended in 1841.
When the famine struck in Ireland in 1845 and the workhouses were full of destitute men, women and children, families as well, Earl Grey, who was the Secretary for the Colonies and the colonial government in Australia, decided to fund a scheme to bring respectable, healthy young women from the workhouses in Ireland.
It came to Earl Grey's notice that there were a lot of orphan children in the workhouses in Ireland as a result of the famine. He also knew at the same time from people like Carolyn Chisholm, who was a philanthropist, that obviously there's a disproportion of males in the colony. So here is a situation in Ireland where there's an excess of young orphan women in workhouses. Here's a situation in Australia where there's a need for young women as domestic servants and potentially as wives and everything else. So this seems to be a perfect coincidence of need.
11 ships came to Sydney, 6 ships went to Port Phillip, and 3 ships went to Adelaide in South Australia. So altogether there were 20 ships, bringing 4,114 young women. Now these were chosen because they were potential marriage partners but domestic servants. And of course the growing colony needed domestic servants, girls who were able to clean, to work in the fields in many cases.
So these girls all had to be equipped with a full box of clothing. It was a long voyage, three months, and there was a surgeon on board and proper diet. So it was a very organised kind of system.
So they're one of the few immigrant groups that come to Australia without having to pay anything.
Here she is. She's my great-great-grandmother. And I suddenly discovered that my great-great-grandmother was an Earl Grey girl. She came across on the Lady Peel, 3rd of July, 1849. The voyage lasted 110 days. She was apprenticed to a dealer in Sydney called Michael O'Brien. It only lasted for about 2 weeks, even though her indenture was 2 years. But she ran away to Moreton Bay, where in January of the next year, she married a man with the name of John Smith. And she had her first baby. She went on to have 14, 15 children. The records differ, not all of them survived. And now I'm here, and I feel so proud of someone who I've never met.
My great-great-grandmother is Mary Ann Rowan, who was one of the famine orphans. My grandmother used to start talking about one of her ancestors, a young girl, came out from Ireland with a cousin by themselves, and it wasn't until my uncle was contacted by a local parish priest and he said, "I've got this stained glass window in the church and apparently it belongs to your family." It was for Thomas Collins. His grandmother is Mary Ann Rowan. So that actually verified what my grandmother was saying.
Thomas Collins was the son of Mary Ann Rowan and John Collins. Mary Ann Rowan was one of the orphan girls that came to Australia in the Argonaut, is that how it's said? She was my great-grandmother. The doctor in charge of their welfare on the ship really wanted to look after them, and after they landed in Australia, he made sure that they were all settled. Mary Ann Rowan was taken by dray out to Yass, and it would have taken a few weeks to get from Sydney out to Yass.
To do that on an ox cart, pretty poor roads, and it's a pretty mountainous area too.
And there was little Marianne, 17, 16 years old, on a cart and horse going out into a country to a place that was quite unknown to her, and the terror of it must have been very high. She went straight into service in a family, and then she married John Collins.
He was a local labourer. They were married in St Augustine's Church in Yass. They had their own farm, Ferryhole Creek, and had 6 children, and one of those children was a great-grandfather, Thomas Collins.
And she died in childbirth with the last child, and her children came every year. So she didn't have a very long life, little Marianne.
Because it's such a large group, over 4,000 arriving in only 20 months, the impact on the colony was huge.
My great-great-grandmother was Bridget Ryan. She was born in Brough in Ireland, and in 1850 she arrived in Australia on the Thomas Arbuthnot as one of the Earl Grey famine orphans. She was at Hyde Park Barracks and then hired out as a domestic servant to a master mariner who lived in Balmain. And he lived in a beautiful house called Waterview House. She met a Scot called James Murray. Within a year, Bridget was married. Very soon after that, she had one baby, born when she was 16, and they'd moved to the Manning Valley area. She then had 13 children. One died as a baby, and there are still descendants throughout New South Wales and throughout Australia. The only things I really know about her life come from her obituary, where they were both noted as being pioneers, pillars of the community. The deceased lady was noted for her kindness of heart and sunny disposition. She must have been incredibly strong, and she must have been incredibly resilient. To make that choice to come, I guess the option could very well have been death if she'd stayed in Ireland. So I think I have great admiration for her.
Earl Grey's female orphan scheme gets underway in 1848 and is finished by mid-1850, largely because of opposition on the part of colonists who thought they wouldn't have to pay anything, but in fact they're paying for young women who weren't really trained in domestic service. But I mean, what did they expect?
People weren't very happy about them. They said they were uncouth, that they had no manners, they didn't know how to behave.
There was quite a lot of adverse reaction in the press, not so much just on the Irish theme. It was more about, we don't want to found a colony on workhouses.
My mother told me when I was quite young that her grandma was Irish and had come to Australia as an orphan under the Earl Grey scheme. Her name was Bridget McMahon. She came on a ship, Maria, in 1850. Grandmother was 16 when she came. She had 8 children, of whom she had lost 2. My mother was widowed with 6 survivors of her 7 children, and 4 graduated from Sydney University. And they became quite a remarkable family in educational circles. She was an extremely interesting mother. She was a brilliant scholar, and she was one of the first 2 Masters of Science degrees awarded at Sydney University. And in 1924, she travelled in Lapland with a large group of European scientists. So she'd had a very interesting life. I, in fact, did very well at my school, but I had tuberculosis. The doctors were young, handsome, swinging stethoscopes in their white coats, and I used to look out my window at other white-sheeted people being wheeled down a path. And so I asked what the building was that they were going to. It was the morgue. I got the sort of idea I'd rather be one of the ones who had a stethoscope, you know. And I enjoyed greatly my medical career. I feel a remarkable sense of admiration and gratitude to my mother's mother, whom I never met.
Many of them had lots of children. I mean, I've got instances of women having 12, 13 children. The average is something like 7 children. So when you track that over 5 or 6 generations, which it is now, over 160 years ago, there are a lot of descendants.
It's great to be Australian, and it's great to know that you've got the Irish ancestry. 3 girls that were part of the Irish famine: Bridget Davis, or Davies, from County Clare; Margaret Reardon, she came from Croom in Limerick; and Bridget Mahon from Headford, County Galway. And within 3 years, the 3 of them married to people from out here. Bridget Davies, there's letters that have arrived here from her uncle and aunt in County Clare telling her what was happening to all of her people all around the world. They'd gone to America, South Africa, to England because of the famine. You know, they just had to get out of there. It was just too horrendous for them. Margaret Reardon, she married John Cahoon, and Cahoon is my mother's maiden name, and he was a convict. He was sent out here for stealing a fowl, and his mother was also sent out here for 7 years for receiving a fowl, so obviously he'd stolen it to give to his mother. You know, I've tried to let Tegan know, just, you know, that they were much the same age as what she is now.
I think that'd be so scary. Like, as Papa said, you're leaving everyone that you know you're only getting on there with your sisters, and then it'd just be a scary trip. Like, you don't know if you're even going to make it there or anything, and then you get there and it's a totally different place.
I'm really proud of the Irish ancestry that I've got, because it's just been fantastic to find these people and see the struggles that they put up with to come here to Australia and to start a new life.
I'm quarter Chinese myself. My dad's half and I'm quarter, but
we've got Aboriginal ancestry and Chinese and French and English, Irish, Scottish.
We embrace everything we've got.
It does give me a sense that Australia is a nation of migrants, and apart from the Indigenous people, you know, we're all here. We all come here.
If you give yourself to this culture as an outsider, it rewards you by a narrative that is as relevant as today's news, the riots in Cairo. How do people live together? How do we forgive each other?
I think by remembering them now, it raises within us a consciousness of famine that's happening in other parts of the world, Rwanda, Somalia, etc.
When we look at the Irish famine and we look at famines today, and we sort of ask why, but to me what they all have in common is the question of social justice, and how we regard people who are poor, or how we regard people that we have some power over.
Their courage was extraordinary, I think. And Mary Ann, thank God, was able to produce children. Those children produced children, and here we are today. And God bless us all.